one of the most celebrated texts written in ancient Greece, all the way back in 380 BC, the Republic by Plato is presented as a philosophical series of dialectics, or discourses to get to the heart or truth of a matter or perspective, comprised of 10 books and presented as an ongoing dialogue between the great philosopher Socrates and a group of assembled scholars who comprise the key characters. Among them are Glaucon, spirited, experienced, and articulate, notably telling the myth of Gyges in order to show people conform to justice only because they do not want to risk punishment for behaving unjustly. Adeimantus, more sober and pessimistic than his brother Glaucon, who complains Socrates seems to have prescribed a life of deprivation, even misery, for the guardians in the ideal state. And Thrasymachus, whose name fittingly means bold in war, and champions a cynical view of justice, claiming it's nothing more or less than the interest of the stronger. His position can be described as might makes right. The Republic delves into the philosophical nature of politics, justice, and government. Now, Socrates himself was Plato's mentor and a landmark figure in the history of Greek philosophy, and more generally, of Greek culture, especially as the latter developed in Athens in the 5th century BCE. Socrates reveals himself in his back-and-forth arguments, rife with examples and allegories, as a supreme ironist, as well as a philosopher pretending to be ignorant in order to expose the ignorance of others. Socratic irony proceeds hand in hand with the Socratic method, a series of questions and answers that probe the issue under discussion even more deeply. This method is sometimes known by the term dialectic. The Socratic method is used today as the principal instruction in numerous law schools and in classes where rhetoric and argument continue to sharpen our always growing minds. Now, on to the book. In Book 1, Socrates challenges his friends to define justice and demonstrates the inadequacy of a number of the definitions. Justice could be defined as paying what is owed, or as doing good to friends and harming enemies. The beginning of Socrates' momentous discussion of justice and the ideal state is notably casual and matter-of-fact, as Socrates describes his journey to Piraeus to watch the celebrations at a religious festival. The tone is light, and Plato sets the scene vividly and skillfully, without so much as a hint of the seriousness that is to come. In books 2 through 4, the group pursues a satisfactory definition of justice. Structurally, Book 2 is closely linked to Books 1 and 3 of the dialogue. In one sense, it represents a continuation of the quest of Book 1 for the true nature of justice. Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are usually civil participants compared to nasty Thrasymachus, are almost cynical in their outlook on this subject. Glaucon suggests the only reason people are just is they're afraid of being caught if they act unjustly. Adeimantus adds an appearance of being just is often at odds with the reality of injustice. In Book 2, Socrates initiates the discussion of a framework for the ideal state. And Socrates continues directly on the discussion of education for the guardians in this ideal state. In Book 3, he emphasizes 2 dangers: poetry that dramatizes lamentation or the fear of death, and poetry that prompts or inspires unseemly laughter or merriment. Socrates gives examples of some traditional tales figures being false and encouraging moral laxity. He censures these lies he finds in much traditional Greek poetry and myth. Ultimately, justice is defined as a social condition of balance and harmony, both in the state and the individual. In Book 4, Socrates notably explains his doctrine of the soul. The human soul is immortal and consists of 3 parts. The highest part of the soul is reason. The other 2 parts exist in a spirited division. The higher of these 2 parts is the soul's desire for honor, while the lower of the 2 is concerned with a quest for sensual appetites, food, sex, and material comforts. Doctrines of the soul are a main idea of the Republic Socrates returns to often. In Book 5, Socrates discusses the issue of communal property, wives, and children in the ideal state, commenting on the place of women among the guardians whose talents and temperament qualify them for positions of civil and military authority. Shockingly for his time, Socrates upholds the potential of women to become guardians. However, some of the arguments in Book 5 are arguably the most vexing, problematic parts of the Republic. In this book, Socrates makes a number of extremely controversial claims, as judged by the standards of both his time and today. To evaluate these assertions, readers must carefully appraise both the logic and consistency of Socrates' arguments, and, equally importantly, they must be cautious in applying modern criteria to the discussion. It would be a big mistake to conclude Socrates' comments on the equal potential of men and women as guardians imply an objective approach to the sexes. However unusual by Athenian social standards of the 5th century BCE, Socrates' approach is still tinged with the thoroughgoing and expected sexism of the contexts of his time and place. He favors a system of communal wives and children, declaring such an arrangement will promote social unity and universal loyalty to the ideal state. In books 6 through 7, Socrates develops the idea a true philosopher king should rule the ideal state, in 3 elaborate analogies: the sun, the divided line, and the cave. The divided line in book 6 posits this. Imagine a straight line that's cut into 2 unequal parts. Both divisions are then further cut into 2 parts using the same proportion or ratio. The original 2 parts represent the visible world, the smaller section, and the intelligible world, the greater section. The smaller subsection of the first part stands for imaginative conjecture or opinion. This part's longer subsection stands for belief concerning visible things. The smaller subsection of the second part stands for some ideas or knowledge. Its longer subsection stands for pure ideas or forms. The divided line presents a hierarchy ranging from lowest to highest in terms of truth: conjecture, opinion, thought or knowledge, and finally understanding or reason. The allegory of the cave, which specifically is one of Socrates' most famous allegories, is presented as an argument to Glaucon in Book 7. Socrates asks his assembled listeners to imagine a group of people imprisoned in an underground cave. Starting with childhood, they have their necks and legs chained so they can't turn their heads around. Behind them, a blazing fire throws shadowy images on the opposite wall of the cave. Thus, the inhabitants of the cave see only shadows, which in their ignorance they assume to be the sole reality of their existence. Socrates then asks the group to predict what might happen if some of the cave-dwelling prisoners were freed and permitted to leave the cave for the light of day. After their initial distress and perplexity in the upper world, they would discover the true nature of reality. But if they returned to the cave, their account of reality would strike their fellow human beings as so bizarre, they'd be labeled as ridiculous and perhaps even condemned to death. Socrates then tells Glaucon the upward journey to the light of day is a figure of speech for the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, the idea of the good. The former prisoners who return to the cave with newly gained enlightenment represent the philosopher who shoulders the burden of educating and enlightening others. There's nothing unjust in compelling such a return to the darkness, since the legislator of the ideal state must be concerned with the happiness of the entire population, not just one part. He expands on the theory of form or ideas, another main idea of the book. According to Plato, everything people apprehend through their senses in the visible world is a copy of an ideal form, or exemplar. This ideal form exists only in the intelligible world, or the world the intellect can understand, but the senses cannot perceive. Thus, a table, no matter what its material design or configuration may be, and no matter how solid and substantial it may seem, is not part of essential reality. It's only a copy of the ideal form of the table. And this philosophical doctrine is closely related to Plato's concept. The true philosopher is concerned with the intelligible world, since it is only here true reality exists, and knowledge, as opposed to opinion, may lead to enlightenment. The doctrine of forms or ideas is intertwined with Plato's critique of mimesis, imitation, which plays a major role in his rejection of poetry in the ideal state. Books 8 and 9 get deeply into one of the main ideas of the Republic, justice and government. In Book 8, and at the beginning of Book 9, Socrates discusses in detail 4 forms of government he considers flawed. Each system of government is matched with a corresponding individual whose temperament and character Socrates describes in detail. The 4 types of government are timocracy, government offices are held by people of property; oligarchy, government by the few; democracy, government by the people; and tyranny, government by a single ruler with absolute power. To Socrates, all these political frameworks are flawed because they emphasize false or detrimental priorities. It's important to note in Book 8 that the discussion of the flawed forms of government should be read in historical context. Readers must bear in mind, within Plato's lifetime, Athens had experienced sudden and violent shifts from democracy to oligarchy to tyranny, and back again to democracy. Furthermore, the city-states of ancient Greece exhibited a wide range of forms and styles in government. Finally, Athenian democracy in the late 5th century BCE was direct democracy rather than republican representative government as in the United States. Book 9 is a direct continuation of Book 8 and is all about the tyrannical man who develops, perhaps surprisingly from a modern perspective, from the democratic man. Socrates elicits agreement with the proposition the ideal state, under the guidance of the philosopher king, is at the opposite end of the spectrum from tyranny, the most wretched form of government. In Book 10, Socrates redirects the group's attention to the main idea of poetry again, as Socrates criticizes poetry as mere imitation at 3 removes from true reality. A description of a ship, for example, imitates a real ship, which in turn imitates the ideal form or idea of a ship. In the concluding myth of Socrates focuses on the immortality of the soul. Readers should be aware that in 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial for impiety, charged with disrespecting the city's traditional gods and introducing new ones, and also for corrupting the youth of Athens. Plato was careful to record his mentor's harrowing ordeal. Socrates' punishment was to drink a lethal dose of poison hemlock. For over 2 millennia, the Republic has been regarded as a landmark work of political philosophy. Plato's major ideas in the dialogue, such as the true nature of justice, the doctrine of forms and ideas, and the immortality of the soul, powerfully influenced such later writers as Greek philosopher Aristotle, Roman politician Cicero, Christian philosopher St. Augustine, and English Renaissance philosopher St. Thomas More. And it's very likely you'll encounter this ancient text in your college courses today.